Is this on? I think it is. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. My name is David Goodfriend. I am the chairman of Sports Fans Coalition, but I'm also better known around here as an adjunct professor at the GW Law School. I see at least one of my former students. I won't embarrass you. And I'm really glad that all of you are here today. I'm going to introduce my co-moderator and our panel. But first of all, let me reiterate what today's event is about and why we're here. Recently, the Supreme Court ruled that the decades-old federal statute that prohibited sports betting was unconstitutional. And before we get Alan all wound up on separation of powers,
that's not quite what it said.
We'll just say that states may now authorize sports betting. What previously had been illegal now can be legal, but it requires an affirmative act of the state to authorize it. And as a result, a lot of states are either actively considering legislation to authorize sports betting or already have legalized it. New Jersey, Delaware, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Mississippi, and perhaps others already have taken action to legalize sports betting within their states. And the question arises, if it's going to be legal, what should be the consumer protections, if any, that go along with that legalization? So the purpose of this event is to hold an open forum regarding what, if any, consumer protections should be enacted by any state that legalizes sports betting, or for that matter, by Congress, should Congress decide to act. And I should point out that we are going to take the statements and the conversations that we have today and write a report for at least one and maybe two committees in Congress. The House Judiciary Committee had scheduled a hearing for Tuesday on this very subject. They've postponed it, I think probably because there are a few other issues that the House Judiciary Committee ought to be thinking about right now. But they have invited us to submit testimony on this very issue, and we're just simply going to collect the views that you hear today and present them to the committee. The Senate Judiciary Committee has also discussed having a hearing on this. But hopefully, eventually, what we'll be able to do is come around to a document that proposes, as others have done, a set of principles to guide consumer protection in the era of legalized sports betting and present that to states around the country as those states consider the legalization of sports betting. So I want to begin by making a few introductions. And by the way, thank you to GW Law School for hosting this
Pleasure to have you here.
Beautiful room. Sitting to my right is somebody who around here, I suppose the saying goes, needs no introduction, but Alan Morrison is my fellow moderator today and will be asking most of the questions. Alan is the Associate Dean for Public Interest and Public Service here at the George Washington Law School. He worked for many years at the Public Citizen Litigation Group, which he co-founded with Ralph Nader in 1972. Ralph Nader, I believe, was honored just last night at the CFA, or he was present at the CFA Consumer Federation of America Awards. He's a legend, and so was Alan. Alan has argued over 20 cases in front of the Supreme Court, including my all-time favorite, INS v. Chadha. This is what happens when lawyers get really nerdy. It's like the top hits. INS v. Chadha was a Supreme Court decision that got rid of the so-called legislative veto. Alan argued it. And I'll be asking Alan to moderate most of today's discussion. Sitting to my left is my Attorney General, Brian Frosch, the 46th Attorney General of the state of Maryland, a position he assumed in 2015, pledging to bring fairness, equality, and justice to all Marylanders. And I can attest he's living up to that every day. Attorney General Frosch is focused on cracking down on unfair, deceptive, and predatory business practices and on protecting our national resources, like our beloved Chesapeake Bay, and on bringing transparency and openness to government. So thank you, Attorney General Frosch, for joining us. Sitting next to Attorney General Frosch is my friend Sally Greenberg, the Executive Director of the National Consumers League. And Sally, you've had that position since 2007. Sally's worked on fraud, child labor, life smarts, helping young consumers with an educational program or two. But my personal favorite on your all-time hits is the cameras that go in the back of large vehicles so that when you back up, you can see what's behind you. That has probably saved untold deaths of children that were occurring before those cameras were put in. So thank you for that, Sally. And finally, sitting to Sally's left is Richard Batchelder, partner at the law firm of Ropes and Gray. Richard has advised his clients for over 25 years in a wide range of litigation matters before courts throughout the country. I was saying to Richard earlier, he actually goes to court for real. This is about as close as I ever get to a real courtroom. So this is very exciting for me, but for Richard, it's kind of old hat. That's okay. But of import for our discussion today, Richard is a member of the sports law group at his firm and has represented the National Association of Basketball Coaches, a little company called Reebok, and the University of Miami, among others, in various matters, including Miami's decision to leave the Big East and join the ACC. Ever since Maryland left the ACC to join the Big Ten, we've been smarting over that. So I'm glad at least we have one fan of the ACC here. At any rate, I want to make sure that I hand it over to Alan to start with some of our questions. And by the way, for those of you who've joined us today in the audience, please don't be shy about asking questions once we've finished our round up here. I want to make sure I leave enough time so that you can ask questions yourself. So Alan, take it away.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to be able to help out a little bit here today. So what do we do now? The Supreme Court has unleashed the states. They have gambling. You can't be expected to know what every state is going to do, General Foch, but what about Maryland? What's the situation in Maryland now?
Well, in Maryland, sports betting is not legal. The General Assembly would have to pass something that...
But other betting is legal now, right?
All kinds of other betting is legal. And there is some significant betting that is in a gray area. We don't know whether it's legal or illegal. And by that I mean, in about 2007, I think the General Assembly authorized casinos to open and operate in the state. And one of the provisions of the law was that it had to be approved at referendum. It had to be they amended the Constitution and said that any expansion of commercial gaming had to be approved at referendum. And then in 2012, casinos were established. 2012, somebody slips in a little bill, supposedly an innocuous bill that says, daily fantasy or fantasy sports betting is legal, and the comptroller can regulate it. It was never sent to referendum, and when daily fantasy sports betting started for real, they were operating in Maryland, and somebody finally, the light bulb went on and said, wait a minute, what about this law that said it should have been sent to referendum? Is it an expansion of commercial gaming? That's never been resolved. So if somebody were to introduce legislation to allow just straight up sports betting, it would have to be put to referendum and approved by the voters.
Simple majority of the voters?
Yes.
Okay. And so what is the thinking in Maryland? I mean, obviously there's gambling on sports now if you consider horse racing sports, which most people do. And do you think that the Maryland's going to go for that, or do you know? And is it your call, or?
It's not, I no longer get to make policy. I'm no longer in the General Assembly.
Okay.
And when I was opposed to all of the expansions of gambling that I've just mentioned. In fact, I was the only person in the Senate to vote against the daily fantasy sports bill. And I think expansion of gambling is bad. I think expansion of gambling is a bad thing. It promises a lot of revenue, and in fact, revenue flows in, but it goes out the back door because the costs of law enforcement and social services dramatically increase when there is more active betting going on in a state or local jurisdiction. So the profits that are advertised, I think, are illusory. And if you're asking me what I would do if it were up to me, I would say, no, let's not expand.
So is there discussion about whether, if there is any gambling, sports gambling, it will be just in the casinos or in other places, or could it be online? And what does that mean in terms of online?
Right. Well, I don't know.
You see them as the same problem or different problems?
Well, here's the way I think it's going to play out. You have now very powerful moneyed interests vested in Maryland. The casino operators and owners have a ton of money that they're making from their operations, and they will go to the General Assembly and say, hey, look, if you want us to remain profitable, want us to remain a source of income for the state, you should let us be the ones who control sports betting. Make them come to the casino and bet. And if I were betting...
A betting person.
I'd bet on the casino.
I bet that isn't the last time we'll hear that analogy today. Okay.
But I bet on the casino owners.
So, Sally, what do you think about this as a revenue raiser? You and I have been around long enough, I hate to say this, to remember when the numbers was used particularly in the low-income areas, where people bet on the numbers every day. Somebody got smart and said, well, let's don't do numbers, let's do the lottery, and let's have the state take the money. And the FBI used to spend millions and millions of dollars every year prosecuting gamblers, and that's how they got some of the big ones on tax evasion. But it turned out to be, well, not perfect, but okay. So is this a good idea for a source of revenue? A bad idea? It won't raise any money, or it'll put the tax on the wrong people?
Well, I should, full disclosure, this is the first time the National Consumers League has opined on the whole issue of gambling, and the founder of the league, Florence Kelly, in 1899, would probably be aghast that we were weighing in on the issue of gambling. But first of all, I want to thank GW, and I want to thank Professor Goodfriend, and there was somebody named as well as David Goodfriend. So he's been terribly supportive of the consumer advocates like us, and I want to make sure we recognize that. And of course, I'm delighted to be here with you, Dean Morrison, because
Alan, I believe my
you
name.
are, yeah. Well,
as long as you and I have known each other.
We're observing a little bit of protocol here, but I think it's important to, and thank you, of course, Attorney General Frosch, because we really rely on our AGs across the country to protect the interests of consumers, and most of them do, I would say, a fair to middling job, but you were really one of the greats, and we are so glad to have you in the state of Maryland. I want to set the stage a little bit, if that's okay.
Please.
So in May of 2018, Maryland had 6 state casinos that generated $156 million a month, representing a 15% growth in revenues since it became legal to have casinos. Also in May, $46 million in gambling revenues went to Maryland State Education Trust, and I think that's one of the big selling points that the casinos and the gambling industry provides to states across the country. Estimates are that the 50-state market for regulated sports betting in the United States will be worth anywhere from $7 to $15 billion in revenue, and could attract 44 million additional consumers, $245 billion annually. The Washington Post estimates that currently there are $50 to $100 billion spent on illegal gambling online. So the argument, of course, is bring it into the legal fold, and we'll be able to tax it, and we'll make money that we're not making now. 20 states are already trying to implement laws to legalize sports betting in the next 5 years. 32 states are expected to pass legislation to authorize sports betting. So to answer your first question, Alan, we think no, it is not a good idea. I think there are many fault lines for consumers, and we know that there are ways to regulate things like fraud that have to be part of any state plan of action. We have to keep the age numbers of those who are going to be betting on sports at a maximum.
Is that a problem with the casinos, General Frosch? Is that a problem with the casinos keeping out underage people?
I don't think it hasn't been a problem. I mean,
so that's the argument for the casino people. Well, if we have it at the casinos, we can keep them out. Whereas if those dangerous people online, they have no idea how old they're going to be.
Yeah, when I want to certainly yield the microphone, but I think it's important to know there have been several bills introduced both in Congress and in the state level, and I'd like to have a chance to talk about the kinds of consumer protections they provide.
Before we get to that, we do absolutely have to address that, Sally, but I want to get Richard in the conversation. And you are, Richard, familiar with online platforms because you've worked with the fantasy sports leagues. DraftKings, for example, is headquartered in your state of Massachusetts. You've represented them, I understand, from our conversations. Is there a way to differentiate between what goes on online and what goes on in the brick and mortar casinos. Is it possible, for example, to enforce an age limit like what Sally just mentioned when you're dealing with an online establishment? Massachusetts has some experience with this.
Well, let me thank also David for inviting me to this panel. I'm speaking on behalf of myself, not on behalf of my firm or any of my clients. And speaking on behalf of myself, I'm actually in favor of legalizing sports betting. I was in the Supreme Court when the case was argued. I thought the arguments were compelling. This is a law, the 1992 law, that in my view should never have passed in the first place, and now, many years later, we're righting the ship. And I feel like it's 1933 all over again when Prohibition, after many years, ended, and states began to regulate consumption of alcohol. And obviously, you need to have some regulations, but each state will end up making its own decision. In some states, if you want to buy, some Jack Daniels, you have to go to the ABC store because it's regulated in that way. In other states, you go to a liquor store. In some states, you can get beer in a grocery store. In some states, you can't. I mean, there's all sorts of various permutations here, and I think it has to be done sensibly. And I think states need to be careful that they don't try to capture a market share and then only have their neighboring state end up with different regulations that will eclipse whatever they're trying to do in that state to raise revenue. States want to raise revenue. It's been mentioned, obviously, the casinos have a very keen interest in this. But speaking as a father of two college-age students who enjoy sports and I'm sure would like to place a bet on sports, they both have gone online to buy stocks. And there's new apps now that you can buy single shares of stock without paying fees. And, they can do that. They could also join the military. They can vote for the President of the United States. In Massachusetts, they can buy a lottery scratch ticket. And in a lot of states, the proposed legislation is that they couldn't place a $10 wager on the Celtics game. And, I think we have to look at this responsibly, but I think we also have to be aware that the times they are changing. And this is happening, and it's going to happen. It's going to go online eventually. There's no question about it. It's just a question of when and how are we going to regulate it.
By the way, quoting Bob Dylan is very acceptable these days after the AT&T Time Warner ruling where Judge Leon said, you don't have to be the weatherman to know which way the wind is blowing. So I guess it's a big year for Dylan.
So, Richard, you were surely right about the NCAA case, because if the Supreme Court could agree 9-0 on something of significance, that's got to be clearly wrong. And so you're right about that. But you said this is like 1933. Well, it is, but it isn't, of course. There was no internet in 1933. And so the problems of controlling internet gambling are different from the problems of controlling sales of liquor that physically has to be delivered from someplace to someplace else. And I take it you're suggesting that internet's going to happen. I guess one question I want to ask you and the other panelists, is this an area where the federal or Congress should step in and at least set some basic rules, or should they leave it to the states, leaving aside whether anybody's ready to do anything sensible now?
Well, you're right about the internet obviously being something new, and certainly in 1933, no one could imagine that. But even now, it's difficult to order wine on the internet and have it delivered to your house because of all these regulations. And as someone that likes to drink wine and buy it from a California winery and have it shipped to my house, I'm happy to have a verification that I'm 21 when the package arrives, but I don't think we should have so many regulations that tie up that kind of commerce. But in terms of federal versus state, I think it should be left up to the states. I think, though, once the online aspect, I think there are going to have to be conversations around whether this falls within the Federal Wire Act or not, because obviously that...
Tell us what the Wire Act is and how it might apply.
The Federal Wire Act applies across state borders, obviously. So if I'm in Massachusetts and Massachusetts doesn't allow online betting, but say Rhode Island does, could I, from Massachusetts, place a bet in Rhode Island, right? And the Federal Wire Act might implicate that and prevent me from doing that, even if Rhode Island was happy to accept the bet. So what some states are talking about, because of technology, is a geolocator. So it would know that I'm in Massachusetts. And so when I tried to place that bet in Rhode Island, it would reject the bet. So there are ways to deal with this issue, but I think consumers are going to want convenience, and they're not going to want to go to a casino necessarily to place a sport bet because they want to watch the game at home, and they thought about what they want to place on the game 5 minutes before the game starts. And so I think that some states are going to be creative about this, just like some states were creative about laws regarding corporations, and why do South Dakota have a lot of the credit card companies are based in South Dakota. Mm-hmm. So some states are going to be creative about this, and then if there can be online, I think the other states are going to have to catch up. And I think we're obviously in the very early days of this, but when we look back 10 years from now, I hope that we're not looking back and say, wow, I can't believe we had those initial regulations. They seem so quaint now. I think we should allow consumers responsibly, just like drinking you have to do responsibly, everything else you need to do responsibly. I think we need to have a framework that protects people that are vulnerable, prevents the kind of addiction that can come along with this, but recognize that this is what people want, and people should be able to do this if they want to do this with their own money.
General Frosch.
I don't buy the last argument. We protect people from a lot of things they want, and it does society a lot of good. I mean, obviously, opioid medication is
I was thinking the same thing.
And this is going to be a race to the bottom. I think there's no question about it. You're going to get states that are as aggressive as they can possibly be. They'll stretch it right up to the limit, and they'll try to make sports betting in their jurisdictions as easy, free, and open and accessible as they possibly can. They won't tax the proceeds significally, and they will try to sop up all of the business. But I think Congress should set minimum standards for all of the states, because we know that people become addicted to gambling. We know they lose the rent money. We know they lose the food money. And we know that it causes more crime when we have more active gambling in certain areas. So it costs the state to allow these kinds of things to go on. We need to have some assurance that states are going to at least recoup the costs. And there's always this promise that it's going to provide millions and billions of dollars for education. And what you see in Maryland and you see all over the rest of the country, in fact, is that the General Assembly's raid the budget. The governor raids the proceeds, because you'll have a year where they're a little bit short. They need to balance the budget. We'll just take it out of the Education Trust Fund this year. And no matter what law they pass a new law the following year and scoop up the education money. And
we could put it in the Constitution, I suppose, but that's a bad idea for other reasons.
Right.
When you start talking about the rent money, it reminded me that the problem goes back to Guys and Dolls.
Sure.
What's the guy doing with his union dues?
Right. You got it.
Same thing. Sally?
Or Pete Rose, or the John Sayles movie, 8 Men Out. It was called 8 Men Out, about betting on sports. There's lots of stuff in popular culture, which, of course, we're all dating ourselves, but I recommend going back and looking at the history of Pete Rose betting on Cincinnati Reds, who he was managing at the time, and his argument that he wasn't, but we found out later that he was.
But Sally, I think that let's drill on that for just 1 second, because there is an argument put forward by sports leagues that there's a need to preserve the integrity of the game. We've talked about consumer protection on one end, but there is this notion that betting on sports could contaminate sports themselves. People throwing games, for example.
Shaving points is the real problem.
Shaving points.
I think it's a real threat. We've got, the film I talked about, it's obviously, it's based on history. It's based on the Black Sox, Chicago Black Sox, 8 Men Out. And it's all about how the players were through the game and were found out later. Would it be okay if I go over some of the areas of consumer protection
Please
that we
do.
think as consumer advocacy as a consumer advocacy organization. First of all, let me say that I want to sign on to General Frosch's notion that we need a federal baseline. We would hate to see, though, preemption of state laws, and I think when I say preemption, I mean there's some bills that have been introduced in
Not to
Congress.
quibble with you, but a federal baseline is a form of preemption. It doesn't allow the states to be less protective.
It sets a base of minimum protection, then states can go in, the attorneys general can go in and do additional protections as they see fit for their
Suppose somebody like Nevada, I think I pronounced that correctly, says we don't want to have any rules. That's the way we like it. And leaving aside whether they can export that, what business does the federal government tell them that they can't? They can't say we're not worried about protecting our locals. Forget about whether they're dealing with people coming in.
Well, as Brian just said, there's lots of things we protect folks from, and I think that this is an area that really needs some basic protection. So it's appropriate to have. So here are the things that we outlined and feel are important in any federal bill. Fraud protection against phony online betting sites. So that we can monitor and shut down there's going to be folks out there that say that they're legitimate online betting, and they'll have you put your bet on an iTunes card, or we're the fraud.org people at National Consumers League. So
can I ask Richard about that specific thing? Can states deal with that problem, Richard? Do you think about the fraudulent online? Somebody's doing it from who knows where, Russia or one of the states.
Tajikistan.
I think states could do that, absolutely, and
as a practical matter, I mean.
Yes, there's going to if they're sharing in the revenue, which is what they want, they're going to want to have everything above board. I mean, just take for example, if I'm going and buying a stock, I can tell what the volume of that is on that particular day. And if the volume spikes well above the average trading volume for that particular stock, the SEC can step in and shut down trading in that stock. Wouldn't it be helpful?
That's not a state.
But
The mechanism exists.
The mechanism exists. My point is, wouldn't it have been helpful to know how much money is being bet on the Cavaliers, for example, against Golden State? And do some people know that LeBron has a broken hand and other people don't? I mean, there's integrity, right? And by knowing how much is being bet and who is betting, there can be oversight and integrity. If we allow it to stay, in the underworld, there's going to be these problems that happened in 1919 with the Black Sox and so forth. If managers have accounts, then and whether they can bet or not, and they have in their contract they can't bet, I mean, it's pretty clear that could be regulated. So I think putting shining more light on this is better than keeping it in the darkness. And I totally agree that these are the kind of good ideas that can come out of this, where that people can feel like they're playing a fair game, they're being protected.
Nobody's in favor of fraud. Sally.
Okay, so a couple of other items. Prevention and detection software there's state-of-the-art software that's going to need to be continually updated to prevent the kind of fraud that we're talking about and that Richard's talking about, which, by the way, is very hard to regulate now, and it will just get more, the magnitude will grow, and it will be, continue to be hard to regulate fraud because we work on it every day. We talked about underage gambling already. States needing their own, the ability to legislate and monitor, like Brian talked about, what goes on in the state of Maryland or whatever state the Attorney General is representing. They need to see what's going on locally. We believe that the whole idea that borrow here, play here arrangements should be banned. That just feeds the gambling addiction, so that you can't. There's already prohibitions against borrow here, play here kinds of arrangements. I think that should be in any federal baseline bill, certainly in state bills.
Can I ask you?
Sure.
What does that mean about credit cards? Should I be able to use my credit card at the?
No.
I just went to Cuba. I had to bring only cash there. It was not any fun
Right.
walking around with cash all the time. Is that what? Because credit cards are a form of borrowing. If we're honest, General Frost, what do you think about that?
I agree with Sally. I mean, I don't think it's a good idea. Look, we know that when people become addicted to gambling, and it's really not hard to do, they'll bet way much more than they can afford. If they have access to immediate sources of cash or credit, they'll go longer than they should have gone, and they'll lose more money. I mean, the whole thing about sports betting, casino gambling, is the house is going to win. You're going to lose eventually.
But that's true at the casinos now. Anyway,
It absolutely
do you
is.
see a difference between them?
Well, I do. I mean, certainly for what we've seen in daily fantasy sports is there are players who predominate. There are folks with access to algorithms and computers who just beat the hell out of the average Joe who wants to bet on his fantasy team. And the same thing, I believe, will happen with widespread sports betting. I mean, so I was going to say I've been playing poker my whole adult life. In fact, I've been playing poker a lot longer than that. I know when I sit down at a table, if I can't look around the table and see who the sucker is, I'm the sucker. and in all of these games, you guys, we are the suckers. There's somebody out there with more information, better.
That's the fantasy. I mean,
the same will be true. The people who have information, who know whether somebody's tweaked his toe, we're all going to lose money in this.
Richard?
Sooner or later.
There are literally thousands of websites tracking the latest lines and who does what, and they're free and accessible. I mean, the average person that's going to be betting in sports that's going to be getting to the point of being addictive is going to be the person that's following all those different websites. And, they don't have to have a $25,000 Bloomberg terminal like they do to buy a stock necessarily to be pretty smart. And that's why I think, we have to trust people a little bit more and can't just tell them what they can and can't do with their money. I agree about the debit card could be used very differently than a credit card, right, because you're not borrowing money. But people don't carry cash anymore, so there has to be a system whereby people can have some sort of automatic pay because people just don't carry cash.
Alan, I just want to offer a preview of our next panel, because on our next panel, we're going to have some people who have really drilled down on these issues of how best to implement these exact kinds of consumer protections. So you're not going to want to miss that, folks. Stick around for the second panel.
So we've got an experienced trial lawyer and attorney general here. I've got to ask this question about, somebody's talking a moment ago about taking care of problems locally. So the question is, what does that mean in the context of internet betting? So suppose I'm a resident of Maryland. I moved out of the District of Columbia, so I have some status now. Maryland. I want to place a bet with somebody in Illinois, but I'm in New York at the time. First place, what states have the authority to control that in any respect, how old I am or how much I can put down? And second, if there's a tax imposed, who gets to impose that tax? And have we figured any of that out yet? And if we haven't, how can we go ahead? So I leave it to General Frost. You're the Attorney General.
I have no idea.
Good, okay. That's as good an answer as I...
This Supreme Court decision just happened. I don't think anybody, certainly in Maryland, nobody has thought through all of
Is that something that people ought to be thinking about?
Well, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, yes.
Richard, thoughts about either part of that question? Who has jurisdiction to control the bettor, and what happens to the money?
Well, there are a couple ways you could do it based on the bettor's resident. Just like if I, earn income outside of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, right? Commonwealth of Massachusetts is the one that regulates my income in addition to the federal government, right? But I may make enough income in a particular jurisdiction that then that jurisdiction has an interest in that income as well. So there is a way to parse this out. There will also be, and this is very important, there will be a record of bets placed. And it will be, real people placing real bets, and everyone will know who won, who lost, et cetera. That doesn't exist right now. Everything is shady. I mean, you have a bookie. Bookie doesn't care what your name is. Bookie wants to get your money. And now to do it, you'll have to, have some sort of verification and so forth. And there can be a much better mechanism, I think, to regulate problem gambling, because you will be able to know who's gambling, how they're getting into trouble, and how to address that issue.
Well, let me address the tax question. Every state in my hypothetical there is going to want a piece of the action. To bring a phrase in.
Or betting talk.
Yeah.
Well, is that true? Is that undoubtedly, I mean, is that undeniably so? Is every state going to go forward? And I want to add that there's a several-step process to getting this on the ballot in Maryland, to getting it. It's not a done deal. It won't happen until 2020. Then it's got to get on, the legislature has to put it on the ballot. It's kind of a complicated process. And I'd like to know from our Marylanders, is it going to happen? Is it a done deal? Is the casino industry so powerful, or is this so tempting that, anyway, you know where I'm going
Well,
with
if I'm the
this.
bookie here, I'm giving odds.
Yeah, you're giving odds.
And the second part of that is, and yes, we want the money. I mean, if it's a Maryland resident, we want a piece of the action.
If they approve it, I should have made it clear in my hypothetical. States have approved it, and now they want their share. That's the problem. I mean, you're absolutely right, Sally. That if they say we don't allow gambling, it's going to be pretty hard for them to take a cut, which is going to drive them to say yes on gambling.
Did we get through your list, by the way?
No, just to honor the consumer advocacy piece to all of this, there are things like deposit limits already, Richard, right? About the money that you can spend when you go to a casino, and maybe online too. I'm not as familiar with the online limitations. There's something called self-exclusion, which is when people say, "I don't want to be approached. I've got a gambling addiction." And by the way, 2.6 million Americans, it's estimated, that's probably a low estimate, have a gambling addiction. Turns out to be about a $6 billion problem. It's about what percentage? 2.6% of the population. 10 million Americans are deemed to have a gambling addiction. Lastly, tax revenue from online sports betting, if we've got to have it, should go to education or public good that can't be rated by the legislature. And we need, of course, privacy and data security safeguards, because every single day there are millions of attempts to get into our data and breach our data, and that will be a new playground for fraudsters. So those are some of the basics we'd like to see in a federal bill without preempting states.
So you say a federal bill.
Should include.
The baseline bill that we were talking about with some minimum protections across the country, and then states are free to enact stronger protections of the kind Brian's talking
Richard,
about.
what do you think about that?
Well, look at what's happening in the marijuana debate right now. We've got, in my state, it's becoming legal, but the federal law says that it's illegal. So that's just a lot of uncertainty. And the response is, well, the U.S. attorney in Massachusetts won't prosecute. Well, that's not really a good answer to a problem. And so I think that the states and the federal government shouldn't be at cross purposes, certainly. There shouldn't be legislation that...
Well, Sally's wouldn't make it across. As I understand it, Sally, the federal government says you got to do at least this if you want to do more. That's not at cross purposes. I mean, I agree with you 100%. The marijuana
Well,
example.
look at what the federal government did with the drinking age, right? Most states, a lot of states wanted to stay at 18, and many states did stay at 18. And then the federal government says, well, we can't regulate this, but if you want federal highway funds, you got to have it as 21. And guess what? Every state went to 21. I think Hawaii was the last one to do that, and they had the fewest miles of federal highways. But the point is, that, in my view, is regrettable to have the federal government dictate to states what they should do in this situation. I think states should be able to make their own decisions. I think there can be common ground. I mean, these issues shouldn't be heavily debated, in terms of some of these safeguards are basic safeguards that you would want. You want it to be fair. You want it to be transparent. You want people that have addiction to be able to get help. But you also, I think, want to allow free will and people to be able to do what they want. And if they want to place a wager and enjoy a game a little bit more, let them do it.
I have a special announcement to make. We're going to let one of our we're going to let one of our panelists go because Attorney General Frosch, along with several other attorneys general, has sued the Trump administration. We're about to? Yeah. About to sue the Trump administration again on the separation of families at the border. So I guess that's more important than sports betting. I'd have to confess that.
Thank you for
separation of families, not separation of powers, right?
Correct.
Thank you.
thank you for being involved with this case.
Thanks, Harry.
Thank you.
So we have a couple more.
Can I ask Richard one?
Yes, go
Richard,
ahead.
you said that people should be able to agree, but I thought I heard you say a few minutes ago before that you didn't want to you wanted your sons to be able to bet on sports even though they're under 21, and suppose Congress and Sally would like to keep it at age 21, I think.
Well, I think people can.
Is that an agreement we can reach, or it doesn't sound
I
like?
think we can reach an agreement if it's 18.
Let's stop arguing. Just agree with me, right?
I'm a trial lawyer. I can't help myself. No, I think it's an important discussion to have, 18 versus 21. And I get back to in Massachusetts, for example, a scratch ticket, which is highly addictive. If you go outside of a Dunkin' Donuts, you'll see people, trying panhandling for money, and they take the money and they go buy the scratch ticket. It's very regressive. And our state relies on the revenue from those scratch tickets. I think we have more revenue from our lottery than any state in the country. We were the ones that started the lottery, started the scratch tickets, et cetera. But they can do that at 18. And I don't see a principled reason to say, well, you can buy a $30 scratch ticket or buy as many of them as you want, but you can't place a bet on the Celtics game. I just don't see that.
So you would say if you're going to allow anybody to do any form of gambling, and you should keep it the same age.
Be consistent.
You're not okay. That's a different proposition than that.
And I understand the casino interests want to keep it at 21 because then they can prevent, the Hooters. Imagine if you're Hooters, right? You have your whole business model set up around, people watching sports, right? And if
do we have to use Hooters as an example?
They're only watching sports, I promise.
Exactly.
And drinking beer.
And drinking beer and having a good time, or Buffalo Wild Wings, whatever chain you want to think about, right? When you walk in, there's
It's a little better.
50 TV screens. They would love, I'm sure, to be able to have their patrons be able to place wagers on those games. So, is that going to be possible? And can you do that at age 18? Or, does somebody at the table have to be 21 to do that? I see a future where, you'll be at a table in one of these restaurants and just like you go to the airport now and you place your order on one of those little iPads, they'll be scroll through and do you want to place a bet on the game? That's going to happen. And I just think we have to embrace it. And, okay, how do we control it in a way that keeps everything on the up and up and protects people that are vulnerable? And we can have a debate as to whether somebody 18 is vulnerable or 19 or 20 or 21.
Sally, we exhausted your list yet?
We also would like to see a private right of action, of course, because
and who would Richard and I get to sue over what?
Not using state-of-the-art fraud protection, for example. Other violations that we know corporations and companies engage in.
I think all of us are agreed that certainly publicly,
we want to
fraud is a bad thing.
But it's very hard to police, and it will grow exponentially as a result of this.
Is there fraud going on now in the unlawful bookmaking area?
Well, we know that there's. I'm sure there is, but I don't have data on that. I know how much fraud is out there. Just garden variety fraud. We've got our staff here. Brian Young, who's here, works on fraud issues every day, and it's really hard to prevent it, and it grows. And the ingenuity of fraudsters and scammers grows, by the month. So I think this will be a very rich area for fraudsters. Can I just say that I would love to hear Richard comment on what Brian noted about this notion that gambling and the revenues from gambling contributes mightily to the general fund, and we put aside money for schools and all kinds of good, positive things. And we certainly would want to see some of that money funneling to the right causes. But he has, I think, made a very persuasive case that in the end, it costs states and it costs our society more to have legalized gambling. It destroys relationships, it destroys jobs, people pay their last dime and then some, they go into massive amounts of debt, it destroys dreams, and he, when he balanced the cost out, I thought he made a persuasive case that it's really it's very cost ineffective way to raise state revenue.
Well, I think that's just a value judgment. People either are for it or against it. I mean, New Jersey, the vote in New Jersey on the sports betting bill in a state as divisive as New Jersey between Republicans and Democrats was unanimous. So every single legislator in that state was making a judgment that that was good for the state of New Jersey. Not one person voted against it. The Attorney General mentioned in Maryland, he was the only one that voted against the daily fantasy sports. So there is I think, a decided push for this, and I do think we need to make sure that it's done appropriately. I mean, to take one example in terms of the betting, the biggest sporting event in the world is going on right now, the World Cup. Not the Super Bowl. We live in a bubble here in the United States.
We only have one country in the Super Bowl.
It's the World Cup by far. And in England, a pretty advanced industrial nation, they have literally, you can go almost any block in London and place a wager on those games. You can place a wager at the end of the quarter of games. You can place prop bets. You can do all sorts of things. I haven't seen a decaying of the society in England. I just think that we need to understand that, we have this, and this whole thing goes back to our founding fathers. We have a Puritan streak here. We had blue laws in this country. We did a lot of things in this country, and I think that we need to, recognize that this is coming and do it, seize this moment to do it in a way that does protect consumers and people that are vulnerable so that we don't increase any addiction problems and so forth, and hopefully realize these revenue because states, frankly, I mean, I'd rather have revenue drawn from this than additional taxes, in my own view.
Make no mistake, this is a tax. It's just a question of what you label it. You're taxing somebody.
Well, that's the same thing with, I know I have to pay a sales tax if I buy a certain thing, but I can avoid it if I don't want to buy that item. So I don't have to pay this tax unless I want to have
as opposed to an income tax.
Right.
Is what you mean.
Oh, the state will also get the income tax, because again, unlike now, people will report this. I'll have to report it. Why? Because there'll be a record of their gains. So if I'm a terrific bettor and I'm making $10,000 a year for my gambling income, 39% of that will go in taxes.
All right. We promised some audience opportunities for questions, so we'll begin.
Brian, can you help hand out the microphone? All right, young man, you are going to have to identify yourself and how you and I first met.
Sure. Tom Struble with our Street Institute, former student of David and Alan, actually.
Boom.
Right there. Chevy Law back in the day. So, great discussion so far. We came really close to touch on this particular issue, but and if you did, I missed it. But this was obviously focused on one recent Supreme Court case, but there was another one today that also relates to this discussion. The Quill case is 5-4, but overturned the existing precedent that said states couldn't tax online commerce if the company didn't have a physical point of presence in their state. That is now gone, so states like North Dakota can tax e-commerce even if the company has no point of presence. So in this context, could states repeal their existing bans on gambling if they want, if they have them? Then I think that means the Wiretap Act no longer would apply because you're no longer violating the law. And if they're concerned about local policing, they just want the revenue. If they were just taxing out-of-state transactions, FanDuel or whatever is in Nevada or New Jersey or whatever, if I'm just taxing online revenue but not allowing it in physical locations, does that sort of alleviate the concern that Brian raised and Sally harkened back to about the costs outweighing the benefits? Or I guess how else does interstate taxation...
If I could say a word about Quill. Quill dealt with the question about whether a state into which physical goods were sent can require the out-of-state seller to collect the equivalent of a sales tax. Right. All right. That didn't say anything about taxing internet sales. In fact, Congress has already got a law about prohibiting taxing internet transactions itself. But even if it didn't, that wouldn't necessarily deal with the problem of whether there's a sufficient nexus, because the opinion today made clear there has to be a nexus. Didn't say what it had to be, but I'm not sure that the communication across state lines on a bet would satisfy the court. But that was part of my question to General Frosch as to what the connection had to be and which states were going to be able to or going to try to claim the revenue. But I think the point is that it's a very open question as to who can regulate and who can collect.
And I just would add to that. You're always going to have in internet jurisdictional questions this nexus coming up. So internationally, for example, some countries are requiring U.S. internet providers to put a server physically in their country so that that country can exert some form of legal jurisdiction. Here, what you're talking about is, I think it's just writ large, a big issue about how states can reach in and grab transactions, whether it's in order to impose a sales tax or in order to impose any other kind of governance. Would you agree with that, Richard?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the states are going to be, as I said, there's going to be some states that are creative about this. I mean, for example, what about a state that has, a number of its own facilities and may decide that it's going to allow sports betting in its own facilities? So the state itself will be the house. There's nothing that would prevent a state from doing that. Other states may not have that infrastructure or don't want to get involved in that. But these are all going to be interesting issues, certainly.
Can I make one point? I love audience participation, but we're starting to morph into something related to how states are taxing and what the nuances. And I want to stay with the determining fair consumer protections for sports betting, if we could.
Please.
I guess questions can go any direction, but it's getting a little more arcane, and I think the consumer protections piece is
well, if you can't figure out who can regulate, then you can't figure out who's going to protect it.
We have a pretty good idea. Within states, we know that there's going to be a certain amount of revenue. We see in Maryland, there's $156 million coming from the casinos every month.
Those are physically there, Sally. We're thinking about the problems with the internet regulation.
Just saying.
Okay. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Hello. My name is Karen Biot, and this is Alexandria Milliard and Tina Tran. We're here on behalf of the Multicultural Telecom and Internet Council. The data shows in general that the largest number of gamblers come from the poorest segments of the population. Can you discuss the multicultural nexus here, and how can we protect those who may be more at risk than others?
I'm just going to repeat that question because we had a little bit of a mic failure. So you're from the Multicultural Media and Telecommunications Council, or Internet Council, and the question was, from a multicultural perspective, given the fact that gambling, addiction or problem gambling disproportionately impacts lower income communities, is there a nexus from a multicultural standpoint? I'm going to start, and then I want to hand this up because I feel passionately about that. To the extent that there is a correlation between income and race, anything that disproportionately impacts low income, by definition, is going to disproportionately impact somebody who is disproportionately low income. So that's kind of a truism, right? Of course there's a nexus to multicultural issues here. Of course there is. But I think rather than stamp these consumer protection issues as somehow first multicultural and second consumer, I would say they're all the same piece. Now, I'm going to turn to a noted consumer advocate to add to that, but that's just my 2 cents.
Well, I think that underscores the importance of having some basic consumer protections, because that'll protect everybody, and particularly if you're talking about communities of color, which are more prone to maybe losing much-needed funds for day-to-day. You said there's a correlation. I don't doubt that that's true. I haven't really looked at the data. I think both, we're talking about the federal base. I didn't get to talk about what Massachusetts did, and I'm sure Richard knows, but is there not a regulation set in place by the AG in Massachusetts that outlines, that I think she issued after this decision came down, that talks about things like no gameplay by anybody under 21 years old, professional holding betting to only games on professional sporting events, which would mean not NCAA and college sporting events, compliance with federal and state data security laws. All those are going to protect people who are more prone, I think, to be tempted or interested in the sports betting. And I see Brian saying there's lots of questions in the room. All the more reason why we need both federal baseline and state protections, because it will protect everybody across the board, especially the most vulnerable.
Two more questions.
Let me just quickly respond. If you go into a casino today, there'll be people that will have their cup of nickels playing the slot machine for hours on end, and then just down the other end of the casino, there'll be a high roller poker game with a $10,000 buy-in. And so there's not a one-size-fit-all thing, right? There'll be some people that will want to bet $5 on their local team that they support in a game, and then there'll be other professional types that, will be placing large wagers. So I think that it's a very relevant question. It's a question that I often asked in Massachusetts, for example. We know by the scratch tickets, we know what communities have the highest percentage of scratch ticket, purchases.
And they are?
And they're in the lowest income areas in the state, right? So that's a known. Hasn't stopped the state from pursuing the lottery, right? In some communities,
Owning the lottery in most places.
yes, but it is something to keep in mind, that regressive aspect to it. But
Absolutely.
I think there's a way to do it in a way that still gives people that opportunity. There are people that will be doing this for fun, and there'll be some people that will be doing this because they think they can make money at it, right? And where that line is drawn is an individual decision.
Time for the next question. Who is it?
Megan, you have to, I know you have to call it forward here. So.
Thanks, Brian. So good. Hi, I'm Megan Hannigan from PayPal. I'm not sure.
I don't think it's working.
Push the button once.
We can hear you.
We hear you fine.
We can hear you, but other people, the online people can't hear you.
Okay. So I know Sally talked a lot about fraud and data security. I'm curious if you think in this new world that we're imagining of real money gaming, if there's a role for existing fintech companies to play to authenticate the users in terms of when the payments are processed and received.
I'll just repeat the question for our folks watching online. So is there a role for fintech platforms given the fact that there's a data security issue and a transaction security issue? Is that safe to say?
Right. And I guess under whose jurisdiction do you think it is in terms of the data security and the fraud prevention that you were acknowledging?
I absolutely think there's a role for the PayPals and those who are in your industry, because you guys have been at it for a long time. You're fraud experts, and you continue to improve on your software and the technological developments that ensure that fraud is kept to a minimum. Although I don't think we're ever going to, fraud's never going away. But I imagine that you guys have spent a lot of time since this decision thinking through how to play a big role in this, and I think we should all welcome that, because your fraud platforms are very robust, and I'd love to talk further with you and ensure that the best minds are going into preventing fraud.
Yes, I'm sorry I didn't point out Megan Hannigan is from PayPal, a great company that does online payments.
One of the advantages of PayPal is for certain transactions, PayPal will refund the money if you buy a particular good that doesn't arrive and turns out you're being defrauded. So that if I'm choosing between various sites to place a bet and one offers that protection and one doesn't, right? That's where the market is going to go. And I think there are a lot of entrants in the market like PayPal. I mean, you talk to people my son's age, for example, it's the idea of paying somebody in cash to reimburse them for something, or let alone writing them a check, is like they've got Venmo, and boom, there it is. And they make fun of me for not having Venmo. So, this is where it's going. I mean, we can't just think about this in 20th century terms.
The last question.
I think we have one. Yeah.
Question? There? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Mark Peterson. I'm a student here at GW and an intern at Public Knowledge this summer.
And you got the mic to work.
And I got the mic to work.
That's impressive.
Telecoms advocacy. So there, you mentioned earlier an issue about shaving points, and there is kind of a real potential issue of betting on point spreads and teams trying to kind of shape how those are projected in advance. How big or how high do you think the Chinese wall between the betting organizations and the sports management companies needs to be in order to prevent that kind of bleed over that we've seen in the past?
Richard, I think you're.
I think integrity is essential. And I don't know if you've heard of this story, but it was, I think, within the last year or so, there was some tennis match, I believe it was in Australia or someplace, and someone that was like 365th in the world, like who would even know that they're playing, never mind betting on the match. And all of a sudden there was a huge amount of money placed on this person to win this match that they weren't supposed to win. And because that was transparent, the World Tennis Association was able to go in, do an investigation, find out that this was not on the up and up, and that player is banned for life. So I do think by making it transparent, right, that's the situation where betting was legal, where they could follow the money and see where it was coming from. That's going to prevent some of the fraud. By keeping it, under wraps, I think there's more potential for, look at what happened in the whole Adidas, University of Louisville, some of these other universities that were caught up in this, paying student athletes to wear their.
That's not a gambling problem.
It's a money problem.
Well,
money
okay.
in college sports is an issue, and I think that this goes to your question: should it be limited to professionals or also amateurs? Right? An NBA player making $20 million a year is going to be less likely to be, influenced than somebody who is on a college scholarship.
Unless they're planning on going to the NBA.
Last question for this panel.
Tierney, I'm here as part of the Washington Ireland program. My interest lies in esports or competitive online gaming, which is slowly starting to reflect the traditional sporting industry more and more. I'd just like to know how these new laws are going to affect esports or the online competitive gaming.
Look, I just want you to know that we invited my friend who works at the Entertainment Software Association, which does gaming, to participate today. She couldn't make it, but one of the things she did was send us an article on just this point, that esports, that is watching somebody else playing an electronic game, not a game on the field, is in growth mode. I don't, do either one of you want to address whether or not we can expect sports betting? Would it even fall within the ambit of sports betting? Is esports a sport? Boy, we could really go down the rabbit hole on this one.
I think the principles across the board continue to apply, that we need really strong consumer protections for whether it's esports or whether states allow betting on college sports. I'm glad to see Massachusetts is saying the online gambling will only be allowed in professional sports. But all the more reason why we need baseline federal and allow states to regulate as they see fit. I know Richard disagrees with me, but...
Well, not necessarily all across the board, but Massachusetts regulation you referred to only applies to daily fantasy sports, and Massachusetts has not yet taken a position on sports betting. But I think what I heard your question is the element of being able to participate in a sporting event as a consumer by either having a fantasy player, so that now enhances your experience. You want to watch the game more because whether so-and-so gets a reception, affects your fantasy team. And then, of course, having money on the game, right, will affect your enjoyment. the leagues are trying to find different ways to enhance fan experience. That's why a lot of the leagues were very much supporters and investors in the whole fantasy sports, because it adds a dimension. And I think you'll see ultimately, think about the Las Vegas hockey team. I mean, for years, sports leagues said, no way, no how will we ever have a team in Las Vegas. And then now you have the Las Vegas Knights. They make it to the Stanley Cup Finals, and they're embraced by everybody. I mean, so getting back to what I said, the times they are changing, and we have to embrace it, and I think we do need to have appropriate protections, but I don't think we want to go too far, too fast. Let's see how this plays out.
Okay. All right, let's give a round of applause to our panel. And I want to ask, given the median age in this room, I know you all can do this. Take out your smartphones, please, and tweet to hashtag sports betting rights. Hashtag sports betting rights. Right now, if you've got a phone in your hand, hashtag sports betting rights, that you're here, that you think it's important, any views that you have, we're going to catalog that and include it in our report on the event. I want to make sure that anybody who didn't get a chance to ask a question can at least tweet at us, and we'll include that in our report. We're 5 minutes behind. I want to give a short break of 5 minutes and come back at 10 after for our second panel on what exactly we can do specifically for consumer protection in the area of sports betting. You're not going to want to miss this next panel. Come back.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.
Oh, great. I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah, really great. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to run.
That's right. Say hi first. I know. Well, we got too much to say.
It's really interesting.
We're going to write it up and give it to the committees, but I think what I'd like to do is also make sure that we get you guys reports.
Yeah, that would be...
Because if he's on Commerce, he's new. Commerce does it because Commerce has jurisdiction over sports. If Judiciary does it,
Yeah.
I want to make sure.
He actually left Congress recently. Now it's on judiciary.
Oh, I knew that. But he's on Judiciary.
It's you until
So it's
he
relevant.
called and you're just like, oh yeah.
You say hi to Chris.
I mean, he just called me yesterday, said he was doing this, asked if I was free to come or since my turn.
Just sort of that.
Well,
Yeah, it was much. We're gonna have you next to Jay.
Oh, the Wilkinson side. Yeah.
Oh my god, that's so crazy.
Oh, no.
Thank you for having me.
Thank David.
I was chomping at the bit. Did you tell? I was like, so yeah.
Very good. Yeah, it was very
You can say so.
and we put something in our
2%. The prevalence is 2%. Not 3%.
Okay.
I respect it.
I remember that. Yeah.
Where do we think we're going first? Where are we going first?
Well, I think I want to
Did you talk about the gaming act?
your model.
The gaming act? Or the
Not the
NCPJ?
2011 statute. Your national association.
Okay.
I wrote it. So, I know, so I didn't think we
Oh, that's relevant.
Oh, it's okay. And then they tried.
If you don't mention that, I'm going to mention it.
I know, I'm sorry.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you enjoy?
Okay, let's try to reconvene so we don't lose our quorum. So thank you again to those of you who are attending and to those of you who are watching online, and especially to our panelists. I think I'm gonna give the award to the farthest traveled here from the great state of California. I'm going to start right here in the middle by introducing Kurt Eggert, professor at the Alona Cortez Elder Law Center at Chapman University in Southern California. Professor Eggert is also the director of the Elder Law Clinic and runs Chapman's Elder Law Center, as I mentioned. He teaches both clinical and doctrinal classes. And in his scholarship, he's focused on gambling regulation, which is quite relevant to our discussion today, predatory lending, consumer credit, and elder abuse, I think also relevant to our discussion today, all of them. He's testified before Congress on predatory lending issues and is a member of the Federal Reserve Board's Consumer Advisory Council, where he chairs the subcommittee on consumer credit. Past tense? You were? Yeah. Well, it's like the Hotel California. You can check out, but you can never leave. So you're permanently on that. But thank you for coming all the way from California, Professor. Sitting right next to me is Brianne Dura, the Director of Policy and Communications, the Massachusetts Council on Compulsive Gambling. Brianne has served in that role for 5 years, I believe, and previous to that was the Associate Director of Operations and Development at the National Association of Development Companies in McLean, Virginia. So welcome back to your stomping grounds. And speaking of Virginia, last but definitely not least, all the way at the end of the table, is Professor Irene Leach, President of the Virginia Citizens Consumer Council. Dr. Leach received her PhD at Virginia Tech, where she now teaches, and where she's been an extension specialist or teaching and research faculty member for 32 years. She focuses on consumer pocketbook issues and citizen involvement in the policy process. As president of Virginia Citizens Consumer Council and president of the board of the Consumer Federation of America and president of the American Council on Consumer Interest, there's a pattern here. Are you picking up on this? There's a lot of consumer advocacy. Dr. Leach has been a stalwart advocate for consumers on a range of issues. But I think it's important to note that Consumer Federation of America has recognized Dr. Leach with its Esther Peterson Consumer Service Award, putting you in the upper echelons of heroes in the United States who've been advocates for consumer rights. So with that, I'll throw it back to you, Professor Morrison, for our line of questions.
Well, one of the advantages now is that you've heard some of the discussion, so Kurt, you want to go first, since you were first introduced, and tell us, are there consumer protection issues that you think we need to talk some more about that we started talking about before? Angles that we need to think about? Compulsive gambling how do we define that, and what can society do about it? If that's not too big a question.
I hope I can add something. If I can't, I'll just walk out.
I'm sure you can.
I think it's important to keep distinct two completely separate issues, which is harm minimization and consumer protection. So harm minimization is the idea that gambling can be addictive. We can have problem gamblers. We can have at-risk gamblers who aren't quite problem gamblers but could become problem gamblers. And so we need to set up systems that help people not become problem gamblers, also help problem gamblers control their gambling to the extent they can, and also to provide medical and other help for people who already are problem gamblers.
You use the word we, right. and is that the royal we? Is it the state? Is it or is it something else? Because I think it's not unimportant as to whether we're talking about a state role, and if so, how is it done, or is it something else?
I think it has to be the state's role, because there's nobody else with the power to do that. The casinos aren't going to do that because a lot of their income is from people who gamble a lot. And so if they start detecting and stopping problem gamblers and also start tamping down at-risk gamblers, they will lose a significant portion of their income, and they don't want to do that. So it has to be a state actor, and I think the states have a responsibility. Once states start accepting an income stream from gambling, it's on the state to make sure that they're not taking money from an industry that's going to harm their citizens. So I think the state has a responsibility once it legalizes.
Let's see if we have agreement on the panel on that proposition.
I couldn't agree more, and I think Massachusetts has proven. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you just got to be close enough.
Massachusetts has proven that this system can work. In the 2011 Expanded Gaming Act, we saw the state act. They put in a revenue stream where it ensured something called the Public Health Trust Fund was enacted. That is a fund created off of the revenue from the gaming operators to go for harm minimization, the treatment of problem gambling.
And what kind of gambling is allowed in Massachusetts, just to be clear?
So we have the lottery right now. The 2011 Gaming Act allowed for brick and mortar casinos to come into operation. We have we currently have a slot parlor that's operating. In next month, we'll have our first large casino establishment with MGM, and in 2019, we'll have another casino come on board.
And so that money is in effect a tax on the revenue.
Yes, a percentage of the revenue that is generated by gaming goes into this public health trust fund to mitigate harm and to make sure that we have treatment accessibility for those that struggle.
Was there resistance to that on the part of the gaming industry or others?
It's new, right? This is a revolutionary concept. We aren't seeing this in other states, or we haven't. Look, we have a great working relationship with the casino operators. I think it's important that we're all involved in this discussion. It can be great that the state is acting, but it's going to take the agreement and participation of all parties involved. So sure, could this have been a new concept for the casinos? Yeah. Do they love it? I'm not going to comment on that because I'm not them, but they're doing it. We have GameSense info centers, which are places in high traffic areas of each of the casinos where individuals can go and learn about the odds and the risks of the games that they're playing. If they need help, they can voluntarily self-exclude. They can get information and resources about what they're engaging in or about the addiction and how to get help.
Kurt, is that what you had in mind in terms of?
That's all good stuff, and I think more states should do that. I think it's not. I think we could go a lot further, because a lot of harm minimization techniques involve changing the game itself. So a good example is pop-ups that pop up while you're playing, especially ones that ask you to sort of self-reflect. You've been playing this game for 2 hours and you've spent more than you normally spend. Do you think this is a good idea? And having that pop-up cause you to reflect. It's not taking away your autonomy. It's not telling you what to do. It's just saying, is this such a good idea?
So great that you bring it up. So there's something called Play My Way, which is this infrastructure built into all of the games. It's a budget betting limiting tool. So what this allows is people to say, look, I can only afford $20 today. And when they're getting close to their limit, it will say, you're at $18. Do you want to continue playing? Now might be a great time to take a break.
Can they change their mind?
Of course. People can change their mind, but we're empowering them with information and education to make an informed decision for themselves.
I wonder if I could just jump in. Your organization, your national organization, has developed a set of principles. And could you talk about that? Because it's really been a great resource for a lot of people. What are the basics to consumer protection?
Thank you. So I think the basics start at there needs to be a regulator that's put in place. This shouldn't just be people can operate without one regulating body. So that's like a gaming commission, for instance. That's where we believe it needs to start. Surveys and data. Look, we don't know a whole lot about sports betting. There's not a lot of data out there right now because it's been illegal. So having a dedicated funding stream to look into prevalence rates, what's happening with gambling as it stands right now, and then to follow it. What is going to happen to the gambling landscape and the people that are engaging in this behavior as we introduce sports betting? So looking at what is happening as we expand. Let's see.
Can I interrupt? I'm going to bring Irene into the conversation. This all sounds fine, but it costs money, right? And one of the rationales we heard in the first panel was that states are going to use this for, I'll say education, but it doesn't make a difference what it's going to be used for. As soon as you start talking about helping problem gamblers, you're taking money away from education. And so some of the sponsors of this are gonna feel, wait a second, that's not what we want to do. That's somebody else's problem. Do you or your organizations have any views about that almost inherent conflict?
Well, for starters, I am using what my perspectives are. I'm not representing one of the organizations in what I'm saying today, even though some of them are starting to talk about some of this. But there is the concern that you would keep the money to do the kind of things that you're talking about. And that even with the research, is that research going to be done in a way that does reveal what really happened, or is it being done by a neutral third party or by one of the parties who has interest in it? And it can be a problem. But I would agree that the states are a good place. When I think about all of the gambling type activities that are going on, and being from Virginia, where we've got the lottery and we've got horse racing and so forth. There's a lot that's already out there, and hopefully we could build on that if we expand it. But from my perspective, we're particularly looking at low and moderate income consumers, many of whom have a hard time balancing their budgets. And through the work that I've done with personal finance, the addiction piece and the taking the money away from the family becomes a problem. And another aspect that hadn't been discussed so far, there's accounts that get set up and people put a certain amount of money in it. Who could access that money? If somebody's not paid their taxes, could the state do it? If they've not paid child support or alimony, could somebody access that? A creditor that they owe, could they attach somehow those earnings and things? And so we need to think about some of those kinds of aspects of things as well.
So how is this gambling education problem going to get to what several people have noted already, the prevalence of the lottery in the lowest income brackets? That is, it's what you don't have any pop-ups at your local newsstand where you buy your scratch ticket, and so should there be other efforts made in that direction too?
If you're going to allocate funds to something like a trust fund that goes to mitigating harm, the funds should be turned over to departments of public health and other state agencies that can be going right within the communities that are most vulnerable, whether that be low income or talking about different races, working on prevention strategies, intervention, and treatment. I think that that's where we need to be talking about. You're right, there are no pop-ups. There's nothing to stop it. The lottery's here. It's engrossed in a lot of the culture. But there are tools that we can be using these funds towards to help those.
Kurt?
To address the point, I mean, it's easy to say the lottery is really bad, and as long as sports gambling isn't as bad as the lottery, it must be okay. I don't want to go in that direction, but there's a real difference between lottery tickets and sports gambling, especially sports gambling on the internet, in that the lottery, you go to the place, you buy your tickets, you wait 3 or 4 days, and you see if you won or lost. So people it's easier to budget how much you're going to do because you go there, you buy it, and you're done. On interactive sports gambling, it's like 24/7. You can be betting on, ping pong matches in Japan at 4 a.m. because you woke up. It is a much more dangerous game as far as...
So the internet, so maybe if we had them just at the casinos or at special shops, that would be different?
I think that would be different in part because you would have to intentionally go there.
Is that what they do in Europe? For example, in the United Kingdom, they have these sports betting terminals at various pubs. Brianne, you're shaking your head.
Well, I just want to backtrack. So I think it's important to note that lotteries aren't all just going and getting a scratch ticket or playing the numbers and waiting a few games. There are many states that are looking, Massachusetts being one of them, that's considering something called the iLottery, where we are talking about making the lottery accessible on, I don't have my phone, but on our smartphones. So this isn't just an issue we're talking about when it comes to sports betting. It is engrossed in our casinos and in our lottery. Our lottery products are sold in our casinos. So now, if there's an iLottery product, would that be in my casinos, which is my sports?
Is that in existence in Massachusetts?
So it's not. It's a bill that's being considered. It's been in discussion. But look, the reality is that if sports betting does become legalized, why wouldn't they be considering it in the online form if the lottery is considering it in the online form? So I think it's an important topic we need to think about transcending all types of gambling.
Oh, I want to ask the question. At the last panel, somebody raised the problem about credit cards and the fact that although I walk around with not a lot of cash, but cash in my pocket, I pay for lunch with my cash. Just I don't know why, because I always did it that way. But I see people going in and buying a cup of coffee and putting a credit card in if they'll accept it under $5. And what are you going to do about what should the forget about internet because that's the only thing you can do is on credit cards or PayPal or something like that. What about other forms of gambling and what about credit cards and extension of credit and so somebody goes to an ATM machine, gets some cash out on credit, and then they go gamble. What should the state be doing about that? Irene?
You know, we need to try to avoid bringing credit into the situation, and yet you go to an ATM. I mean, there's no real way to know what people are going to use the money for. So we've got a real problem there. But we also need to recognize that all these online things are going to have a record. And one of the things that I see working with students who are, as you described, used to everything online and they don't worry about that, I worry about having every piece of information about what I do and where I do it and when I do it and so forth, where that somebody could follow it and who knows what kind of information they could put together. And I know enough about statistics and so forth to know that a lot of times you end up with results different than what you thought you were going to get. So, this having all of this as a record is something in a country that has not done much about privacy compared to the rest of the world. The United States really hasn't. And so what could happen to this information? One of the issues that's been raised is, could it end up showing up on your credit report? Well, if I'm a creditor, I might like to know that somebody likes to gamble even, but on the other hand, is that really what this is all intended to be? And we've got a lot of people who are not questioning how they're protected about their information and what they do. And so I think the state does have an obligation to consider some of this.
What does Massachusetts do about credit now?
So in our casinos, you cannot use a credit card to gamble. So there's something called the Responsible Gaming Framework that our Gaming Commission has compiled in order to protect the consumer and those that are most at risk. And there is a section here. It's called Cash and Credit Transactions. And it says, for many players, limiting access to cash on the gambling floor is an important strategy and supporting positive play. And so using credit cards to finance gambling results in high fees, interest rates charged, and so it is not allowed for the purposes of gambling. There are restrictions to access to cash during gambling. Debit card transactions cannot be initiated within 15 feet of the gambling area.
Wow.
So it goes on to elaborate exactly when it is appropriate and when it is not, and it is all done in the best interest of the consumer. It is not saying you cannot engage in this behavior, and there aren't ways to be positively gambling, but there are safeguards that have been proven through research and tested and tried out that are.
So it'll slow them down but not stop them, Kurt? Is that sort of the philosophy?
A lot of these things, people say, oh, we shouldn't put chains on the gamblers. If people want to gamble, they should be free to gamble. But most of what we're talking about is giving people the power to regulate themselves. And so it actually increases their autonomy if they can make more thoughtful decisions about what they want to do. Take self-exclusion, for example. I think that states who implement this should have self-exclusion programs.
Tell everybody what that means and how it
where
operates.
you can say, I do not want to be allowed to gamble for the next week or month or year. Or I don't want to be allowed to gamble after 11 p.m. because I know I have a drinking problem. And by then I'm making terrible decisions. And if you have gambling online, you should be able to put that into place in a way that it really stands up.
Can those be revoked?
If you want to revoke it, you should be able to, but you should have to go through a process. So you're not just trying to gamble and then, okay, I'll revoke it. It has to be a process that requires some time and some more thoughtful action than you can. But you need to, but I think people should be able to say, you know, I'm gambling too much on the weekends with my cousin. I just don't want to do that. I'm going to stop.
Brianne, let me interject here for a second, because in Massachusetts, the fantasy sports regulations that the Attorney General put out anticipated this by doing a couple things, setting a cap on how much you could bet in any given, restricting it to one per person. What were some of those, and have they been successful?
Oh, they've absolutely been successful, and I really want to stress this voluntary self-exclusion, that it shouldn't just be for our brick-and-mortar casinos. It should transcend all of the online platforms, no matter what we're talking about, daily fantasy sports. I think that it's important to distinguish that the state should run it. I don't think in many states right now, you have to go into the casino if you want to self-exclude. Talk about putting someone who's already got an issue or is at risk, at greater risk, by making them walk into the establishment. Our Attorney General considered all these things with daily fantasy sports. So redirecting to the helpline number, saying here's a game center where you aren't engaging on daily fantasy sports, but you can exclude from this. I think it's about access to that information and education about where you can seek help. And the Attorney General really made sure that all of the operators had to provide that to the consumers.
What about when a family realizes that there's a problem, but the person doesn't?
Oh, that happens quite a bit. So we run the 24/7 helpline within Massachusetts, but there's also one at the national level. People call out all the time. My spouse has a problem. My child has a problem. What can I do? There are some that advocate, and the National Council has stated that where family members should be able to say, we feel someone has a problem, we believe that they should be excluded from gambling or whatever the activity is. There are resources.
We say should be excluded, meaning a third party has the right to exclude them.
See, that's where it becomes.
I'm just trying to clarify.
Actually, some people propose an adjudicated exclusion, so a family member can go and present to some neutral third party, here's the situation, they have a wife and 3 kids, they're gambling away all their money, their kids are going hungry, exclude them. So it's not just the family member having the right to do it, it has to be proving to a neutral third party that it's appropriate.
I'm going to ask Tom Struble from R Street Institute to make sure you comment on this, because I want to make sure we're not casting this as what you might call over-regulatory. Like, is the preservation of choice, preservation of self-regulation, from your perspective, sufficiently light touch, or is it too interventionist to say this is the role of the state and these are the things that have to be imposed? We want to make sure we hear from you in that, but first I don't want to step on your toes, Alan, if you had another question, Piano.
No, I mean, we can do that now. I've got lots of questions here, but I can hold them all.
Tom, can you reach over and grab that microphone, because I think R Street's perspective on this is important.
Cool.
If you can get the microphone to work, it's extra 10 points on your gambling.
Okay, I think I did. But anyway, yeah, thanks. So, R Street's a free market think tank, so tend to be, pretty big on individual liberty, economic and civil. But we're not, anarcho-libertarians. I'm willing to embrace government regulations of some sort, typically default to transparency. I think transparency is often the best and sometimes the only thing you need in terms of making the market function better, and transparency around gambling, I think, absolutely makes sense. I would even go further in certain cases and say, where there's negative externalities that are not captured in these market transactions, maybe there's some government role for regulations to force the parties to internalize those negative externalities. So there we're talking about, does it, denigrate the quality of the gameplay and hurt the sports leagues and other consumers who have no interest in betting. That would be bad. It hurts families. It hurts, crime. Obviously, there's lots of things that, superficially I could see increased sports gambling resulting in, but I don't actually have data. I don't know how much research there is on this to know how likely the harms are, what the benefits are, because at the end of the day, if we are talking about government regulation, that's a cost-benefit analysis for me. So that's my general perspective on this issue. But
so you don't, as a more conservative-leaning group, you don't find these concepts to be anathema, let's say, to free market principles or to your regulatory philosophy?
No, not to me personally, and I think our street as a whole would agree with a lot of what's been said. Particularly, we do a lot of harm reduction work when it comes to like e-vapor and tobacco policy. It's not me in person, so me personally, so I don't know exactly where we come down, but broadly speaking, yeah, there's been things I liked and agreed with, things that I questioned or disagreed with, but yeah, I'm not fundamentally opposed to any of this.
Well, let me ask a question that hasn't come up yet. What about advertising and promotional activities? Buy one, get one free. Have we started to see those yet in the gaming business? And do we expect to see them? And what kind of concerns ought we to have about those?
We see a lot of advertising in casinos. I live near a casino.
In the casinos or both?
Radio ads, I'm talking about. Which there are two different casinos that have the loosest slots in town, which they can say because nobody knows what that means and they're not judged on that, and nobody knows how loose the slots are. See, this is one of the problems with the gaming industry is it's been built on a fairly complete lack of consumer protection. And I'll give you an example. Slot machines, one of the most popular gambling things, if you go up to a slot machine anywhere in the US and want to know what is the hold percentage of this slot machine.
Hold percentage being?
Okay, so a slot machine has a hold percentage, which means that on average, let's say for every $1 you put in, you'll get 90 cents back in winnings. Maybe not all at once, may take you a while to do that, but if you play it 1 million times, on average, you'll lose 10% of what you wagered in that machine. Another machine may be set at 5%, which is, if you think about it, half as expensive. Why can't we tell this is a 10% machine, this is a 5% machine? That's the most important datum for a slot player, is something they're not allowed to discover. And so if we have that as the overlying principle, consumers don't need to know the most important things about their gambling options. If that's the organizing principle, then we'll have no consumer protection.
This is not one of my areas of specialization, but does the same casino have different sets on the different slots?
It's really up to the casino manager, and the amount of reporting varies by states. Some states require each casino to do generalized summations of what their hold percentage is. I think Nevada says, we will give you that information by neighborhood, so you can tell, oh, it's more expensive to gamble on this strip than in North Vegas, like, duh. But you can't find out which casino is offering the best deal, and you can't tell in the casino which machine is offering the best deal.
But how does that translate to sports betting?
Well, so if we say who has been allowing this to happen, it is the gaming commissions in each state. The gaming commission has never said, you have to disclose as people are gambling what the hold percentage of their slot machine is. And if they haven't done that, how are we going to trust them to do consumer protection for other things they regulate?
Right, and do we know what percentage of the earnings actually gets paid back out so that people get it? Do we know what the expenses are, and are they reasonable? And so a lot of this information, it needs to be auditable.
Oh, so let me challenge you on that. I go to the movies.
Mm-hmm.
They don't tell me what percentage they get to keep. I see what the price of popcorn is, what the price of admission is, and the price of sodas. That's all I get. Why should the gambling industry forget about the machines? But you can. Why can't consumers make up their mind? And what kind of information are going to have to disclose about all their internal profits? I should think that'd be pretty intrusive in the Roosevelt Institute would not be in favor of that.
Well,
R Street.
It's partly a matter of making certain that the consumer is getting, that gamer is getting benefit back. We do it in insurance, for example, where we set risk loss ratios that we require. So there's some other places where we've done that kind of thing. But again, if you look at it, the transparency, the knowing, the public knowing the information is important in terms of trusting. We haven't talked much about criminal kinds of things yet today, and whether it gets used for money laundering or for other kinds of things, or what kinds of checks we might need for the people who are offering the sport to be sure that that's not run in a criminal way. So that transparency may help us with a number of issues around some of this.
Well, so let me ask this question. Is sports betting any different from any other kind of betting with respect to the issues you've just been talking about? Because that's we're already there in terms of betting. We've got horse races, we've got lottery, we've got casinos, and the question then is sports betting different in some way, and both with respect to in-house, someplace physical, and also online? Kurt?
It's different in two ways. One way that actually helps bettors, and one way that isn't as friendly to recreational bettors. It's better for gamblers because they have, as was mentioned before, a very good stream of data. The more, if they want to figure out how left-handers bat against a certain pitcher, they can find that out. It's so whereas in a slot machine, that's hidden information that an individual gambler cannot discover anyway. So they're betting based on more public data. So that's the good thing. The bad thing, or a different thing, is for sports betting, there are really three different participants in the game. There's the books, who are betting that they can set the line in such a way that with their edge, they will make money.
Right.
There are recreational gamblers who, by and large, are betting on teams that they like and home teams and whatever else they think about. And then there are professional gamblers who have access to all the data that the books have and use incredibly complicated algorithms to determine who's going to win in a certain game. And as we saw with daily fantasy sports, professional bettors are just killing in especially baseball, because it's so reducible to data that professional gamblers were winning some huge percentage of every dollar wagered because they could just vacuum up all the money from the recreational gamblers.
And I believe the Massachusetts Attorney General's regulations differentiate between the amateur, I forget the terms that they use.
And so what they tried to do was having it be on the internet allowed professional gamblers to enter every single fantasy sport, and as often as much as they want. And Massachusetts took very good steps to try to restrict them, to make it so that they're just not dominating.
What's the line between an amateur and a professional in Massachusetts, for example?
I think they did it by amount.
Yes.
A number of wagers within
Number of
a
wagers,
period
yeah.
of time and so forth. And
So if I were really addicted, I could become a professional, right?
And they limit the number of accounts an individual can have. That's another way that they try to control that.
So if you think about sports betting, you have the books that are going to make money because they have a lot of knowledge and they have the edge. You have the professional bettors who are going to make money because if they don't, they're going to go out of business. And then you have the recreational gamblers who are going to lose money.
So here it is. I'll just quickly read from 34.03 of 940 CMR. The highly experienced player is defined in Massachusetts as any daily fantasy sports player who has A, entered more than 1,000 contests offered by a single operator. That's a lot. B, has won more than 3 DFS contest prizes valued at $1,000 or more. So if you've won 3 times, $1,000 or more, you're good. And then once a DFS player is classified as highly experienced, a player will remain classified as such, meaning if you're having a bad day, too bad. You're still classified as a highly experienced player. Has that worked in Massachusetts, do you think, that line drawing exercise?
I do. We're not hearing or seeing anything that's really alarming from these regulations. In fact, I don't think I'd be here advocating that other states should adopt similar things if I didn't feel that it was doing its job. I think there's always more to be done, and there's more to learn. I think that's the one thing I'm getting from both of these conversations more than ever, is we don't have enough data, and we need to be making evidence-based regulations and determinations. And the only way to do that is to start putting funding. There's no federal safety net for gambling addiction, or in this case, consumer protection, alcohol, substance abuse. There's all revenue streams to look at where the issues are and how we should be addressing them. So if this is going to be left up to the states, I can't stress enough that there needs to be a baseline data that's conducted for all the areas, and then follow through with that. What happens after the introduction of sports betting? Are we doing enough? Are you seeing an uptick in crime? Are you seeing an uptick in problem gamblers? Is there a higher rate of bankruptcy? These are all things that we are seeing done in Massachusetts through the Sigma study that are giving us enough informed decisions to be going forth and doing work.
Massachusetts only relates to daily fantasy sports.
So currently, yeah.
Kurt, do you think is that comparable? Do you think that's just the same as regular sports betting?
Actually,
in terms of the professional, what the professional is able to do in terms of.
I think in some ways it was, you couldn't have designed a better system for a professional gambler to make money than daily fantasy baseball, because there you're taking out the who wins the game and you're doing just what are the stats going to declare, and stats are better predictive of other stats than they are of game results. But I think if you look at the how well the books do in various sports, they do the worst in baseball. They have the smallest win percentage because baseball in the summer, a lot of people aren't going to Vegas. They don't have a lot of recreational gamblers. They're really competing against the professionals, and professionals do pretty well at that.
I want to just interject another ingredient to this, because I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions. But so one of the panels, I believe it was Richard Batchelder from the prior panel, pointed out that sports as a product become more attractive if there's betting involved. So let's all consider the fact that the sports industry in the United States is larger than the automobile industry in the United States, that this multi-billion-dollar industry also fuels another multi-billion-dollar industry, pay TV, media. And what you see now, I think it's safe to say, is declining ratings in professional football, NFL football, and increasing ratings in things like soccer, the World Cup. Is there a nexus, if we're going to talk about protection of consumers, and if we're looking at large media companies making money off of sports betting, is there a nexus there? I don't see it in the Massachusetts law, for example. I don't see it in any of our model statutes that we have floating around. What should be done with respect to the making of money off sports betting in media, in telecommunications? Because that certainly is where the money is. Go ahead.
I think there are two nexi, that's a word. One is to...
It is today.
The word's worse now.
It is a word now.
It is now.
And the other is to the leagues, because leagues are proposing what they call an integrity fee.
Yes.
We want a cut of gambling.
And then the players are going to want a cut.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think they should call that a non-integrity fee, because I think what it will do is it will cause the leagues to have an interest in the amount of handle. They won't care so much who wins or loses.
The amount of
handle.
What is handle?
How much is bet total on a game or on a league or whatever. So if the handle increases, the league will make more because they're getting a percentage of the gross. Mm-hmm. They just want people to bet. Yeah. But imagine you're a league that wants people to bet. What you'll do is you'll rejigger your schedule because you want Boston to play LA in basketball every year because that's what people want to bet on. You don't want Sacramento to make the NBA finals because there aren't that many people in Sacramento to bet. And so you have all these concerns. Or is the league having their income based on getting people to bet a lot?
Now, the leagues, a point of fact, though, the leagues were against the overturning of PAPSA at the Supreme Court.
Yes.
Right? Are you suggesting now, or let me ask the other panelists, are the leagues going to do a 180 and say, well, if that's the law, let's have at it?
I mean, I think anything's possible. I think for me, it's plain and simple. If you're going to receive any kind of revenue from sports betting, you should be responsible for funding initiatives to protect the consumers. We need to, I don't think it needs to be more complicated than that. If the media is going to generate revenue from this, then great. We'll take a cut to go towards those that are most vulnerable and need protecting.
So aren't the television stations going to be enthusiastic about gambling because there's more people watching their bets?
Sure.
But at least the networks can't influence the outcome. That's the one difference between the networks and leagues.
As long as
leagues can influence the outcome by determining the schedule. Do you really want to watch the game where you're always worried? Did the league want these teams to be in the finals because they'll make more money? I think that could really harm the integrity of the league.
What's the alternative to an integrity fee then?
Not paying it. The league, the NFL, the NBA have enough money. They're both worth, tens of billions of dollars. They can afford to promote integrity. They don't need gamblers' money to keep their games from being fixed. They should have been doing that already. I hope they have been.
So what about did any of you want to say anything about whether professional sports gambling on them should be treated differently from gambling on college sports? Leave out high school for a second, but let's just stick with those two paradigms.
Let's just keep gambling out of the college and so forth realm. In my role as a faculty member, I am on our university athletic committee, and there are enough issues that are there and enough issues around the paying the players because of the money that they get back and the cost of attendance. There are just a whole lot of things there that we haven't got resolved, and I just don't see betting on. And when you start talking about 18-year-olds and or 18 to 20-year-olds who are, it's not a place that I think the gambling ought to occur.
And I believe, again, in Massachusetts, the DFS rules say no DFS should apply to amateur sports. Is that correct?
So it's just professional sports.
Some people would doubt that NCAA is an amateur sport, but I guess that's a debate for that's a debate. It may or may not be a debate for another day. Kurt, do you have any feelings about this?
I have the same concerns. I also have the concerns about people going to college and then wanting to bet on the team while they're in college, having gambling organizations essentially profit from the University of a state school. Essentially, because our students love our state-supported school so much, they're going to.
And the alums don't?
Well, no, the alums do, but when you're between 18 and 21 while you're in college, you have a special affinity, and that would be a little easy to go after.
That goes back to our prior discussion about should there be an age limit, and if so, is it 18 or 21? It's 21 in Massachusetts, I believe.
So it's 21 right now to go into our casinos and gamble, 18 for the lottery. But I think that this doesn't need to be a sports betting versus casino betting gambling discussion. I think that right now we know that youths who start gambling are more likely to develop a gambling disorder. And if we are gambling in colleges, are we exposing our youth to gambling sooner? And maybe their brains are able and mature enough to handle. Is this going to lead to more individuals with a gambling disorder?
Should we offer some?
Yes, we have some questions from the audience.
Open up to the.
Anyone want to?
I'll go first.
While you're walking to the microphone over there, we're oh, I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead.
So one thing.
Push the button. It's red.
Hello?
Yes. There you have it.
So one question I had was that the online commercial gambling platform can then hire advertisers to determine, from somebody's search history whether or not they may have
they may be a gambler or are likely to be a gambler, and they may target them with ads that could then determine whether or not, like they could gamify ad that might be able to help them determine whether or not a person should be met with online sports gambling opportunities. So what in your mind are some sort of protections that we could create so that data mining operations aren't collecting information about potentially problematic gamblers and then giving them these kinds of opportunities?
Anybody want to start with that?
That all fits exactly with what I was saying about the data and what's done with it and who gets access to it. And, we've really got to come up with some rules about that. And we've not done very well with that in this country so far. So yes, that is really needed to make sure that people aren't taken advantage of as they are by marketing of every product out there today.
Brianne, you had something else to add to this.
Yeah, so I think safeguards in our advertising are crucial. I think we need to be thinking about what those advertisements look like. Are they targeting minors? Are they in an area where minors have access to them? The Attorney General for daily fantasy sports did include advertising restrictions in Massachusetts. I think it's a great starting off point. Do I think more could be done? Maybe, sure. But again, I really want to make...
What are the restrictions?
Yes, so no advertising targeted to minors, no promotional activities at schools or colleges, no promotion in Massachusetts of daily fantasy sports contests that include amateur, college, high school, or student sporting events. As far as promotional offers, compliance with existing laws. So no daily fantasy sports promotional offers shall comply, and then it's a whole bunch of laws. Deceptive use of loss leaders and prizes accepting, and then it gives all the contingencies that can't be advertised. So these are things that would target people to say, oh, but if I only do, or maybe if I log on. So there are restrictions. Goes on. I'm not going to bore you all with the rest of them, but I think that gives you a good idea that there are steps that can be taken to protect the consumer.
And you also mentioned data security. The Massachusetts guidelines, or regulations rather, also require compliance with all federal and state data security measures, although I would argue that may be a little redundant.
There are a lot.
Yes, Maddie.
Push and hold, or just a push? So I feel like in the news and elsewhere, we're hearing a lot about, it could almost be characterized potentially as a parade of horribles. And Brianne, you said something that resonated with me about pursuing evidence-based lawmaking and the importance of that. Yes. So I have to ask, on that premise, is there any chance that states are being premature at this point by adopting regulations and statutes? And if not, what data is Massachusetts relying on for its guidelines?
So full disclosure, Massachusetts is only considering sports betting right now. Last year, a special commission was held on online gaming, daily fantasy sports, and esports. And they were bringing in lawyers, researchers, talking about what is known and what more do we need. I think that states do have the opportunity, though, if they want to act, if they see this as an economic growth opportunity, I think before sports betting is allowed, to start operating, they could take some money, put it towards researching what is the current state of gambling, where are the issues, and then maybe start operating and making sure that they follow through with the research and the treatment through the revenue that should be allocated from the sports betting.
By the way, since I took credit for Tom Struble being my student from GW, I have to take credit for Maddie Lautenbach being his former student from Georgetown Law School, where I'm also an adjunct. And Maddie, you're now at the law firm of Wiley, Ryan, and Fielding. Any other?
Not Fielding anymore.
Not Fielding, just Wiley, Ryan. Fred Fielding's gone.
A long time ago.
If I could add one thing to that, we aren't functioning in a vacuum. The United States has been a laggard in gambling research, but Canada there's great research coming out of Canada, Australia, New Zealand. There are places that have mandated that money go to gambling research. And we can say, oh, Americans are different from everybody else. But, there are a lot of things.
Well, there is one way we're different, and that is that the states can compete with each other and race to the bottom. And so if Massachusetts is going to be tough, it's not very far to New Hampshire and Rhode Island. And we've seen that with casinos. Mm-hmm. And the question is, what if that's the statement of its reality, what should that inform us to do about both state and perhaps federal laws?
But the issue is the race to the bottom for a casino should be the race to gain the most customers, right? I mean,
Well, if you're a
the
state
bottom is
that-
whatever appeals most to the people that are going to come and put money in
No,
your
but
pocket.
for a state, if you have nothing now from the gaming industry, then you have little regulation, so your casinos will come there and get ahead of the people who are going to go someplace else. And 100% of not very much is still 100%, as opposed to, you know, taking a smaller hunk of a larger sum. So, I mean, that's something that seems to me each state's got to worry about.
Right, but imagine that you're in Pennsylvania and you can drive to New Jersey, and in New Jersey you can tell exactly what the hold percentage of a slot machine is, and because they compete on hold percentages, you get a better deal. People would drive to the place that has better consumer protection if it's valuable to them.
But on the sport, we're talking about sports betting now. And so that's different from the hold percentage, right? Because as you said before, you know what the odds are, and you can go shop for the odds and shop for odds now. So,
and that's something that I think has, like sports betting, professionals go to several different books and shop for the best price among the books. Amateurs just go to their bookie and take whatever they're given. So the internet sports betting, one advantage it might have is it may allow amateurs to shop more, to see which, you know, maybe
like airline and hotel prices.
Right. So it could. I'm not anti-gambling. I'm not anti-internet gambling. I just want us to be aware of what the hazards are. And I think at this point we know enough about harm minimization. We should be doing some of it. But if a state wants to ban it or not ban it, that's not my issue.
Irene, you want a final word, and Brianna?
My thinking is that the more gambling we have, the more problems. And so still really hesitant about wanting to support that we move into one more area, knowing about the problems that families and employers have. If you've got an addicted employee, it's a problem. And I'm not convinced that the money it's wonderful to say we're going to have research and so forth, but I've also seen that not come through, and that for things, and that we don't have the data, and we don't end up having enough backbone to make the changes that we need to make once we learn things. We've gotten, as a state, addicted to the money, for example. And
it's much harder once you've got it.
Much harder once you've got it. So,
like the gamblers know.
I think we need to be very cautious. And I'll just remind us that the consumer's right of recourse and being able to come back and do that, Sally mentioned earlier, is one of the things that's really important as some of this is considered.
Yeah. Last word.
I think that ultimately sports betting is here. I think it's a new day for gambling and gaming. I think that states have the opportunity to be proactive. I think it's been proven where you can have a strong piece of regulation protecting the consumer, making sure there are safeguards that can be put in place without overstepping. I think that everything can be amended. Things are up for discussion. I think that's incumbent upon us as consumers to be advocating and having these discussions, holding our regulators accountable, as well as the social and corporate responsibility of the gaming operators that are going to start establishing themselves.
Well, as the saying goes, I wouldn't bet on that. I got the last word.
You did get the last word.
I want to thank David for putting this all together. I had nothing to do with it. Showing up here and tossing out a few questions. So I want to thank our panelists for coming. Thank you all for coming as well.
Thank you so much. That was great.
Thank you.
Enjoy it. Don't let me walk off with this microphone. Let me turn it off first.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
So as I said, I'm gonna write up a summary, and I want you all to you have other written materials.
There you go.
But seriously,
Little like-
send it to me. Put it in some that I can easily hand off to the professional. Great.
I don't think I've ever.
I hope you do. I hope you do.
Thank you for coming. Hope you get a chance to
I
say
have like personal.
Sorry.
But it's all yours.
If you're welcome.
I don't think I've ever defended the casinos.
Work your way to say the thesis on you. Not on the mind.
Seriously.
It was the first time for
It was the first
Oh, right
time
on.
today.
Oh yeah, someone from I don't know if it was you guys or Randall, someone reached out recently before the Supreme Court case to see if we had anyone on the staff who works with issues and was interested in helping out, make Supreme Court, whatever. I forwarded to see so is anyone else interested in this? I'm kind of interested, but not an expert. So, and they were like, no one else knows anything about it, and I didn't have bandwidth to research it at this point. So yeah, I work on the tech team at R Street, FCC and FTC mostly, so telecom, competition, consumer privacy. But yeah, I mean, Section 5, consumer protection law, I'm understood. I think most everything was discussed today, but a lot of specific gambling regs.